They told me never to walk the mountain road after sunset, that the storm clouds held memories of the past, that some things in these woods waited for you, even when you thought you were alone. I didn't believe them until that night. The rain fell harder than I had ever known, each drop striking the earth with a sound that seemed to echo from another time. And then, at the bend where the trees leaned over the road, as if whispering to one another, I saw her. She stood there, soaked through, her dress clinging to the shape of someone who had once hoped and lost. Her hair fell across her face, hiding it from view, but I knew, even before our eyes met, that she had been waiting longer than anyone could measure. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around her seemed heavier, thick with something I could not name. I wanted to turn away, to tell myself it was a trick of the light, or the reflection of lanterns from the village below, but every instinct in me held me in place. And then I wondered, how long had she been waiting? How long had the rain kept her here? And why had no one, not a single soul, ever managed to reach her side? The answer, or perhaps the danger, was just beyond my vision, and I realized that on this road, history does not rest, and some sorrows do not leave, even when everyone else does. The mountains stretched endlessly around me, each ridge cloaked in mist that rolled like restless spirits across the valleys. The rain had soaked everything. The gravel path under my boots was slippery and glistened in the dim light of lanterns hanging from the cabins below. The trees leaned in toward one another, their branches twisted and knotted, leaves dripping with water that fell in soft, irregular taps, like fingers drumming against unseen doors. The wind moved through the pines with a whisper that was almost human, brushing against my cheeks and tugging at my coat as though it wanted to guide me somewhere, or away from something. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a creek gurgled, carrying a scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and for a moment I thought I heard a voice carried across the current, distant and sorrowful, fading before it could form words. The cabins along the road were dark, their windows dull with condensation, and the fences that lined the edges of the path sagged under the weight of rain. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap, and yet there was another scent I could not place, sharp and metallic, almost like iron, that seemed to follow me with each careful step. Even the shadows had a strange weight. They clung to the hollows of the trees and pooled beneath rocks in shapes that the mind recognized but could not name. Something familiar, but wrong, as though the forest itself was watching and waiting. The distant mountains, normally majestic, now felt oppressive, leaning closer as though they bore witness to a sorrow that refused to die. I paused at the old stone marker by the side of the road, its inscriptions worn away by decades of rain and wind. The moss covering it was thick and dark, and water ran in rivulets down its surface, carrying with it the faint echoes of footsteps that had crossed this path long before I ever came. Each breath I took was cold, thick with mist, and carried the unmistakable taste of iron and wet soil. And then I noticed it, a lantern flickering through the trees, distant, unsteady. Not the soft glow of a cabin, but something that moved. Slowly, it drew nearer, or perhaps I moved closer without realizing it. The forest held its silence around me, except for the rain and the subtle, unrelenting whisper of the wind. Somewhere in that quiet, the story of the bride lingered, woven into the very soil and stones, a presence that had outlasted time itself. The road curved again, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing beneath the trees. She was still there, white against the dark green, a shape of patience and sorrow. And even as my mind tried to reason her presence, mistaking it for a trick of shadows, a reflection of the lantern, there was a certainty in the air, undeniable and suffocating, that she had been waiting for longer than anyone alive could remember, and that the rain, the wind, the trees, they all knew it, and they all acknowledged her vigil. I had been walking that mountain road for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up, each step pulling my boots deeper into the soft, wet gravel. The mist swirled around me, curling at my ankles, rising from the hollows between the trees, like smoke from a fire that had burned long ago. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked sharply, and I turned instinctively, expecting a deer, or perhaps another traveler. But there was nothing, only the rain, the forest, and the lingering sense of eyes tracing my every movement. The figure of the bride haunted the edge of my vision, never close enough to reach, yet never distant enough to ignore. Sometimes she would vanish behind the twisted roots of a tree, only to appear moments later under a canopy of dripping branches, standing perfectly still, as though she had anticipated my steps. And though the night was drenched in rain, I could see the glint of something on her, perhaps a wet ribbon, or the faint shimmer of her dress clinging to her frame, and it reflected what little light the storm allowed. Every sound became amplified. The wind weaving through the pines was no longer just wind. It carried the soft sigh of sorrow, faint and incomprehensible, almost like whispered words that slipped just beyond understanding. My own footsteps seemed to answer it, tapping in the puddles, echoing off unseen rocks, mingling with the steady drum of rain into a rhythm that set my heart hammering, each beat louder than the last. I thought I heard the rustle of fabric behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped. My pulse slowed, then quickened again, and I realized I was speaking aloud to myself, though the words sounded hollow in the damp air. It's just the trees. It's just the rain. And then something changed. The rain, which had been steady, seemed to shift its pattern, no longer just falling from above, but falling around me, brushing my skin at angles that made no sense. My clothes were soaked through, yet I felt colder than before, a chill crawling up my spine and settling like ice in my shoulders. From somewhere ahead, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, not my own, not the soft patter of rain, but deliberate, slow, deliberate. I stopped, holding my breath, and the footsteps stopped too. For a moment, I thought the forest had fallen completely silent, and in that silence, I felt the weight of countless unseen gazes. The lanterns I carried or glimpsed in the distance seemed to flicker unusually, their flames bending toward something unseen. A branch snapped just a few feet away, and I jerked around, yet there was nothing. And then I felt it. The air itself shifted, as though it had density, pressing in from all sides, and I became aware of the faintest sound, so subtle I almost dismissed it. Soft crying, carried on the wind, fragile, heartbreakingly human, echoing from somewhere ahead on the road. I strained to pinpoint it, but the rain drowned it partially, and each time I thought I had located the source, it moved, shifting just beyond reach. I pressed forward, boots slipping, hands brushing against wet trees, each step a negotiation with the slick earth. And then I saw it again, her, standing perfectly still beneath a canopy of dripping branches. This time, she was closer than ever, yet still impossibly distant, as if the space between us was elastic, stretching with each step I tried to take. The wet fabric of her dress clung to the shape of someone who had known love and loss, who had hoped, waited, and ultimately been abandoned. My throat tightened. I wanted to call out, to ask her why she lingered here, but my voice caught, swallowed by the rain and the weight of the forest around me. And then the first undeniable, unexplainable thing happened. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shimmer in the rain, faint ripples moving across the wet gravel as though the earth itself remembered her sorrow. A wind gusted through the clearing, bending the trees back and forth violently, yet her figure remained unshaken, unwavering. It was as though she had always been part of this mountain, part of the road, part of the very storm that lashed against me. A crow cawed somewhere high above, and I flinched, feeling as though its cry was directed at me, a warning. My lantern flickered again, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw her lips move, though no sound followed. Then, faintly, almost beneath the storm, I heard another set of footsteps behind me, closer than before, not matching mine. I spun around, but the road was empty, the mist swirling, concealing everything beyond a few feet. My heart pounded, and I realized I was holding my breath again, standing on a road that felt alive, waiting for something I could neither see nor name. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet I found myself moving forward, drawn by something I could not rationalize. The rain had slowed in patches, leaving ghostly reflections on the puddles at my feet, and in one of them I thought I saw her face, pale and sorrowful, staring up at me from beneath the water. I blinked, and the reflection was gone. Then came the sound of soft singing, low, mournful, carried on the wind, a tune I could not place, but that somehow resonated deep in memory, like a story I had once heard from the elders. It rose and fell, weaving through the trees, tugging at my mind, until I could not tell if it was coming from her, from the forest, or from somewhere buried deep within the mountain itself. And still, she remained ahead, motionless, waiting, rain cascading down her form, the night pressing in on every side. My boots squelched in the mud, my lungs burned, and yet I could not stop. Something in the air, something in the very weight of that forest, whispered that I had come too far to turn back, and that there were things on this road, in this storm, that had waited longer than any human could endure, watching, observing, and remembering every soul who dared to enter. I reached the bend in the road, where the trees arched overhead, their branches heavy with rain, bending like fingers reaching out to claim something forgotten. And there she was again, the bride. She stood completely still, water streaming down her pale face, her dress clinging to her frame. But it wasn't the rain alone that made her shape almost otherworldly. The mist seemed to swirl around her, not carried by the wind, but gathering, coiling, and bending in ways that should have been impossible. I took a hesitant step forward, and the forest seemed to shift in response. The shadows around her stretched unnaturally, elongating and curling over the ground, like dark ribbons that moved against the wind. Her eyes, or at least where I thought her eyes should be, glinted faintly in the lantern light, and in that moment, I could feel every ounce of longing, every century of waiting, and every fragment of grief she had carried. It was as though the storm itself, the rain and the mountains, were holding their breath, acknowledging her presence. Then I noticed the reflections in the puddles around her. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but in each pool, her figure appeared multiplied, not quite aligned, distorted, sometimes taller, sometimes crouched as though she were bending toward me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something in me was drawn toward her, compelled to witness what no one else had dared see. A sudden clap of thunder shattered the stillness, and for a heartbeat, the entire mountain seemed to roar. The bride moved then, ever so slightly, tilting her head as though acknowledging my presence. And in that motion, the mist parted just enough for me to see something else. Behind her, faint figures, shadowy and incomplete, flickered at the edges of perception. They were like memories caught in the rain, echoes of all who had walked this road before me, or perhaps all who had waited alongside her. They didn't move toward me, but they didn't need to. The very knowledge of them filled the air with tension I could feel in my chest, pressing against my ribs with each heartbeat. I raised my hand, almost instinctively, to call out to her, to ask if she had waited all these years for this, me, or for someone she had lost long before I ever walked this path. But the sound caught in my throat, and when I dared to speak, the rain swallowed the words. Then came a sound I could not identify at first, a faint dragging, slow and deliberate, circling through the puddles around my feet. My eyes darted down, and for a moment I thought I glimpsed footprints appearing in the wet gravel, but they weren't mine, and they weren't entirely human. The bride's gaze seemed to pierce through the rain, through the mist, through everything I knew of the world. And then, impossibly, the air shifted again, a gust that carried the faintest whisper, her voice, or perhaps the voice of the mountain itself, soft, mournful, just a breath above hearing. He will never come. And as the words dissolved into the storm, she stepped forward, or I stepped closer, I couldn't tell, and suddenly the rain seemed to change around us. It moved against gravity for a heartbeat, droplets clinging to her like tiny lanterns, forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. My lantern flickered violently, casting brief light onto her face, and I saw it clearly. Her eyes hollow, yet filled with longing, grief, and something beyond human comprehension. I wanted to turn, to run, to escape, but every instinct, every cell in my body, froze in place. Then she vanished, or perhaps the storm swallowed her, or perhaps she had never truly been there in the way I understood existence. The puddles rippled violently, reflections warped into impossible angles, and the shadows around me seemed to recoil. The sound of her soft, sorrowful sobs lingered, carried by the wind, and in that instant I realized that this road, this bend, and the rain itself were part of her vigil, part of a sorrow that would endure far longer than any of us could survive. I stood there, drenched and trembling, rain dripping into my eyes, and for a long, unmeasurable moment, the mountain was silent, except for the gentle tapping of water on leaves. And I knew, without a doubt, that she was still waiting somewhere just beyond vision, a presence embedded in the very soul of these mountains, a story that refused to leave the earth, no matter how long the world turned. I left the mountain road that night, boots heavy with mud, clothes soaked through, lungs burning from the cold, and the fear that had gripped me so completely I could barely remember how to breathe. Yet even as I descended into the valley, even as the rain became just another part of the darkened landscape, I felt her presence follow me, lingering in the spaces between trees, in the shadows that clung to the sides of cabins, in the corners of my own mind, where memory and imagination collide. The townsfolk greeted me with polite smiles, yet I knew they too had felt it. The weight of a story that refuses to end, a sorrow that persists beyond a single lifetime. I could hear the echo of soft footsteps in the attic, or was it in my imagination? Perhaps the tapping of rain on my windows was merely rain, but some nights It takes a pattern I recognize, one that mimics the way she walked, the way she waited, the way the world had forgotten her. I tried to reason with myself. It was a trick of light, of shadows, of exhaustion. And yet, on nights when storms roll through the mountains, when the wind bends the trees and rain hammers the earth, I swear I see her. Not as a fleeting shadow, but a figure, pale and wet, standing where the road curves, waiting still. And in that moment, the heart inside me clenches, because I know I will never reach her, because some sorrow is too vast, too ancient, and too enduring for anyone to touch. And she remains as patient as the mountains themselves. I moved 3 counties away, took a road far from the valleys and creeks where the story began. But some nights, I still hear the tapping of her feet in puddles, still see the flash of white in my peripheral vision, and I am reminded that grief, hope, and longing do not simply vanish. They linger. They anchor themselves in the earth, in the wind, in the rain. And I ask myself quietly, in the darkness of my own room, in the silence that follows every storm, would you walk that road alone, knowing what I saw? Would you dare to confront the waiting, the sorrow, the centuries of unanswered hope? Because in the end, some stories are not meant to be solved, some presences are not meant to vanish, and some waits last forever.